Good morning, good evening, or good night, whichever one it is for you, whichever one it is. I am very glad you're here to join me for this week's video because, alas, it is time for another monthly reading wrap up. In this case, the wrap up for all of the books I read in September, the month of September, the start of fall, the start of cozy season, the start of my favorite reading season of all time. So, yeah, I read some really good books. So just you wait, let's get right into it. Because the first book I read in September, or finished, I started it in August, but at the end of August, and I finished it quite early on in September. That is The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, which is very much a staple of lesbian literature or queer classics in general. The Well of Loneliness is the story of Stephen, who is our main character. And Stephen, well, we follow her before she was even born, basically, because the first chapter is about her parents and how they meet, how they get married, how happy their marriage is, how much they want a child, and how happy they are when they actually do conceive a child. And then Stephen is born, but the thing is, her parents wanted a boy. But Stephen is a girl, but they name her Stephen anyways, and in many ways they raise her as a boy. The story of The Well of Loneliness is just Stephen's life story. We follow her through her early childhood, her early formative years, her teenage years, her adulthood. And The Well of Loneliness is a queer classic, of course, because Stephen is gay. And it explores the situation of a wealthy woman. Specifically, she is a wealthy woman in the 1900s, the early 1900s, in a society where that is not accepted, where that is not the norm, where you're basically going to have to spend your life pretending you are something you are not, or choosing not to pretend but being a complete outcast. It is very much about this concept of self-discovery, of self-acceptance, or the question of whether that is even possible in a situation like the one Stephen is put in. It also explores how complicated things become when you fall in love with another person, and then basically another person is introduced into this dynamic. The thing I found the most heartbreaking here is that concept of being gay at a time where being gay is basically taboo, how you basically feel selfish for loving someone else, because that just by the mere fact of loving them, you are taking opportunities away from them. You are making them an outcast by being with them. And that is such a sad thing. And it sounds outdated, but I don't think it feels like that at all. And although The Well of Loneliness is not the most popular book, I do think it is considered a queer staple for a reason. There is so much worth to be found in that book. And it was so touching to just read the introduction itself, because it talked about the effect that book had, how that book was banned shortly after it was published and not unbanned for decades after, how horribly tragic that court case was, because they basically tried to make the book unbanned. They went to court, the author went to court. And a lot of other authors, like E.M. Forster, like the Wolves, were really trying to rally for her, but it didn't work. It wasn't unbanned. The positive impact, the really short amount of time that book was not banned, had on people like Stephen, like the main character in that story, that was so touching to read about. And it gave you a lot of clues and context, because this is a very highly autobiographical work. The author really infused so much of her own life experience into this story, and at many points it is so clear how personal it feels. It feels like a very personal story, which means it feels kind of bad to criticize it. I don't think I have the right to really criticize a book of that personal a nature. One thing that is criticized quite often, and that was even mentioned in the introduction, is the fact that this is not the most representative, the most politically correct representation of what homosexuality is. And I do see the point, because there is a sort of element to this story that could kind of take the validity out of what people see homosexuality as, especially if you view it from the lens of the time it is written in. Because Stephen is raised as a boy, and therefore you could argue, well, or it raises the question rather, if Stephen is gay because she is gay, or if she was kind of raised as a man and therefore feels like a man. From a modern standpoint, you could interpret effort so much into the identity of Stephen, and I think it's not that difficult to actually see what's going on. But I see how that book could kind of do damage at the time it was written in. But honestly, I don't think it's fair to criticize that book as not being representative, because I've never heard of a book about a straight person that was criticized for not being representative of the straight experience. And so I think that is kind of an unfair standard to put towards a book. It is not meant to be representative of everyone. It's just meant to give you a lens into a person's life who is different, a person who is not the norm. And I think that is very valuable. And I think it is such a personal story, and therefore we cannot criticize it as such. The book is not only about sexuality. There is also a lot of different kinds of commentary going on here, and just exploration of the time we're set in, because for a while during the book, the First World War takes place, and Stephen goes to serve as an ambulance driver. And therefore, we kind of experience the life of a woman at the front. And we're also kind of seeing different places in the world, because at some point we're in England, then we're in France. And the social classes and the dynamics of the people in those specific countries is very differently depicted. And I thought that was kind of cool as well. It was also an interesting insight into just noble families, a kind of insight that I hadn't read in this way before. I think there's a lot of uniqueness to this story. The weak points, in my opinion, of this book are, for one, the highly stereotypical depiction of the lower classes. I did not like that, and it is very clear that the author was higher class and that she didn't have the best opinion or the best ability to empathize with the lower classes. There's also surprisingly a bit of a stereotypical kind of depiction of gender roles, which does lend to the nature of the story, because that is a highly relevant part of Stephen's life. But I think beyond that, even the way Stephen treats people is very stereotypical, and the lens of the genders and how they should interact, I think that was quite stereotypical, and I would have maybe wished it to be a bit different. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is just how beautifully it was written. That surprised me so much. I underlined so incredibly much of this story, because the way it was written was just beautiful. I do think it was a very good one. I'm very glad I read The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. After that, I read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I finally read that book. I've been meaning to do that for so long. Heart of Darkness is the story of Marlowe. It starts out on a ship, and it starts out with Marlowe on sea, just philosophizing about life and history and all kinds of things. That leads him to tell a story of his youth, where he was in desperate search for a job and ends up being employed. He was a very young man at the time, being employed on a trading ship that was gonna be going to the Belgian Congo. And it's about his experience there, the Belgian Congo during colonialism. The book is narrated kind of by one of the crew members of Marlowe, who is writing down everything Marlowe is telling us. So it's basically the account of someone else's account. It's really interesting because the narration is very clinical and removed, and so matter of fact. It almost reads like a history text, but that makes it much more devastating because it feels so much more real. And it's an interesting juxtaposition that I can't really put into words. But Heart of Darkness was highly influenced by Joseph Conrad's own experience in the Belgian Congo. This is basically based on a real-life experience. And it's quite different from anything else that was written at the time, because people did not talk about this, let alone write about something like this at the time. Definitely not in novel form. So it's incredibly valuable to read. One thing that is kind of interesting is Marlowe himself. He's less desensitized to things, to the situation that he is put into in the Belgian Congo, but he's still kind of removed from it. Although he does realize that this horrible treatment of the natives is wrong, he does kind of partake in the hierarchy, and he's very much not a hero, and he's kind of part of the problem. But that is exactly the point, because he does sometimes notice and at times even call out, at least retrospectively, the things that are going wrong or that are being done that are wrong. But he never says anything, he never changes anything, he never even does anything himself that is different or that is going to make a change or that is just going to be a decent human thing to do. He never does that. He stays passive the entire time and just basically observes everything that is going on without ever actually taking action anywhere. The way this book goes about depicting how out of place these tradesmen, these colonialists are in the Congo, by depicting the nature of the Congo as this dark and scary place to them that is basically fighting them and trying to keep them out. Because at many points it's described how the natives are being almost like embraced and welcomed by nature there, how they are part of the nature there, part of the land, how the darkness embraces them, whereas the colonialists and the tradesmen are just repulsed by it. It doesn't want them to be there, and it's actively showing that. Of course, darkness also just as the brutality of what is happening there. It is at once the darkness that is inflicted by the colonialists towards the inhabitants, as well as the darkness that is inflicted by the nature itself towards the colonialists. It is the kind of book where the message of it, the use of it, the intention of the author is so clear. It basically screams at you from the page, but he never actually writes what he means. He basically just describes this story, describes the situation in the most clinical and removed way you could ever imagine, but that makes for a story where you cannot help but see what he's doing here without him ever having to actually tell you. It is brilliantly executed. This is the kind of book where you could take any sentence and write an essay about it, because there is so much symbolism and so much intention behind every single word, every single character, every single situation. It is such a memorable book, and I highly, highly urge you to read it. After that, my first official kind of spooky season read was The Tales and Poems by Edgar Allan Poe, which is a collection of short stories and poems by Edgar Allan Poe, which I really enjoyed. It's an interesting kind of mix of things. Some are spooky, some are disturbing, some are magical, some are funny. And my favorites, I think, were the first two. The first one was Metzengerstein, which is the story of two families who have had this rivalry going on for centuries, basically. And I just loved the atmosphere. I loved the vibes. I loved just the feeling I got from it. It felt like the perfectly Gothic story, the perfect story for this time of the year. And then there was one called A Visionary Assassination, which is about this man who is in the canals of Venice, and he witnesses a baby fall into the canal. And then he sort of becomes involved with the people who are involved with that. There's also two stories which I really liked, which were kind of connected. One is How to Write a Blackwood article, which is basically about a man talking to a woman who is an aspiring writer and giving her advice for how to write a good story. And it's horrible advice, the worst advice you could give someone. And the second story, which is called A Predicament, is the story that woman then wrote based on that advice. She literally took the advice so very seriously. And it is the worst story I have ever read, but intentionally so. And it is so ironically funny because of it. Yeah, I just really like them. I also really like the poems. The Raven, of course, is the most popular one in that collection, probably. And it was really nice. It's the one I keep thinking about the most. So those were the Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. Very nice. Okay, people, put on your seatbelts, because next up I read The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. The Books of Jacob starts out in 1752 in Poland, and it follows a few decades after that. We follow the story of a Messiah who actually existed. Jakob Frank was an actual Messiah of the Jewish faith. He created this one specific kind of, I don't want to call it a cult, but it kind of felt like a cult called Frankism, which is his kind of take on the Jewish religion. But Olga Tokarczuk took the life story of that man and just made a fictional story of it. It is highly based in historical information. There is so much just research going into this. It feels like a history book. Most of these characters, or many at least of the main characters you are following, did actually exist in real life. And we basically start out with just abundant descriptions of daily life in a small Polish town, where we start to follow a priest who then goes to that town, to the market, comes into contact with a Jewish family. Immediately you get a sense of that conflict that was going on at the time between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith. Only about 100 pages into the book do we actually first come into contact with the main character of the story, Jakob Frank, who is believed or was believed by many people to be a reincarnation of the Messiah. And this is basically the story of his life, the story of Jakob Frank, told through his contemporaries, through many different lenses. Some are his enemies, some are his allies, some are people who are quite indifferent to him. That makes for a very varied account, because no matter who you're reading from, the lens you get on this man and on what he's doing is vastly different, and it is an incredibly wide-ranging novel. I think it's maybe the most wide-ranging novel I've ever read. There are hundreds of characters, multiple storylines. You are in so many different places. It's not told linearly. It's changing point of views constantly. Also, the format changes often. It sometimes is a book within a book, then sometimes you're reading letters, sometimes you're reading first-hand accounts. The amount of work that went into this book astonishes me, because so much of it is based in historically accurate information. Olga Tokarczuk did her absolute best to make this book as much of a history book as she could possibly have made it. And the author did this thing where she infused this highly historically accurate novel with a lot of supernatural elements, which basically just symbolizes, and it really drives home, just the effect of spirituality and faith on people. It's such a complex net of storylines that are all kind of connected through the people we're following. Everyone is kind of connected in some way. You get a complete feeling picture of all aspects of life, all social classes, all sorts of beliefs, all kinds of people. You follow different genders, different educational backgrounds, different ideologies. And if you love history, and I mean really, really love history, I think you're gonna love this book, because it just feels like the most detailed account of daily normal life in the 18th century in Poland. Obviously, religion does take the main focus in this story, because the story of Jakob Frank is a vessel to explore the conflict that goes on between the Jewish and the Christian faith, the mistreatment that goes with that, the abuse that goes with that. The Muslim faith is also kind of an aspect here. So it's kind of this three-part conflict going on between these three main religions. The way gender roles are depicted, I thought, was very historically accurate. It felt very much like the accuracy was upheld. Women are mistreated, used as objects instead of people, are married off at extremely young ages to sometimes people who are 50, 60 years older than them. Those things are never commented on. They are merely there, and they are just stated like facts, because they were very much part of the norm. No one back then would have really commented on them or found that strange, considering everything you are reading in the book. There is this obvious question throughout: if Jakob is an actual Messiah, or if this is basically just a self-fulfilling prophecy of people who are so lost in life that they just created this meaning in this person for themselves. I think Olga Tokarczuk made this the kind of story where it's very obvious what she's trying to say and what her answer is, without ever spoon-feeding anything to you. With that, there is obviously also a lot of commentary on just religion, the obsessive kind, the cruel kind, the alienating kind. Something you might not expect just because of the nature of the story. There were so many funny moments as well. Olga Tokarczuk has this really brilliant way of writing really dark and horrifying stories, but loosening them up. And it made the story so much more entertaining. I think this was a perfect book. It takes a lot of time to get through, and I think it deserves that you take that time. The books of Jacob highly, highly impressed me. After that, I read Pet Sematary by Stephen King, which is the story of Louis Creed, who is a doctor from Chicago, and he moves with his family, with his wife, his 2 children, and their cat, to Maine, because he is employed as a doctor at the University of Maine, at the campus in this health service, basically nurse's office, I suppose you could call it. And they move into this house on a road that is very famous for being very dangerous, because a lot of trucks speed past there and a lot of pets have been killed. And immediately they meet this elderly neighbor who warns them to be very careful of this road. Overall, I just loved the relationships in this book. I thought the marriage between Louis and his wife, the way they were parenting, the children themselves, I thought every character was just in the typical Stephen King way, so fleshed out. And I loved, in this case, I really loved how he wrote these relationships, every single one one of them. The plot of the story really gets going when Judd, the elderly neighbor, leads the family into this pet cemetery that has been created behind their house and that is being upkept by the children that live in the town. It feels almost domestic and kind of cozy, and I got really comfortable in that. But as you progress in the story, it becomes more and more sinister, and it becomes very, very dark. Stephen King himself wrote the introduction, and he said this is, to him, the scariest book he's ever written. And I agree, it is the most disturbing book I have ever read by Stephen King. The main theme of Pet Sematary is, of course, grief. And what happens to people who are unable to resolve their grief and who basically let grief consume them? That is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. What a journey. Then I listened to The Monk by Matthew Lewis. I listened to it simply because I wasn't sure if I was going to like it and I didn't want to commit to buying it before I knew. It is the story of Ambrosio, who is a monk and who is highly revered for just his piety. He has devoted his life to faith. Over the course of that story, that faith gets tested quite a bit because he becomes infatuated with Matilda, who is a woman who, through circumstances, disguises herself and basically moves into the monastery he lives in, whatever kind of thing a monk does in a monastery. And it's basically just him becoming tempted into a life of debauchery, cruelty, just horrifying things. The way it's set up is really intelligent because the first chapter, we don't know the monk yet. We follow different kinds of people, some newcomers into the town who are confronted with Ambrosio for the first time. So we're basically meeting him as they are meeting him from an outsider's perspective. And it's only in the second chapter that you actually get to hear from him himself and get to know him as an actual person. And it is so distinctly different who he actually is from how he is perceived to be. It was entertaining, to say the least. This story in general, it's kind of dramatic. It's incredibly melodramatic, actually. None of it is subtle. It is such a ridiculous story at so many points. But then also it's incredibly dark. And it is so explicit in its violence in a way I don't think classics usually are, so that was very surprising. The very non-subtly executed theme of that story is the corruption of the church, or of faith in general, and how if you do not live a pious life, then you will bring literal and figurative hell upon yourself and everybody around you. Honestly, why I like this story more than I probably would have is just because I could tell how much fun Matthew Lewis had writing it. I just kept imagining him sitting at his desk writing this manuscript and giggling to himself. I found it entertaining. I wouldn't say I've enjoyed it very much. I'm glad I listened to it because I think had I read it, I would not have liked to read it at all. But as an audiobook, it did kind of feel entertaining. Next up, I read a book that I read in German. The German title is Die drei Fragezeichen und das Gespensterschloss. If you were to translate that, it would literally be The Three Investigators and the Ghost Castle. The Three Investigators is my childhood nostalgic series. I grew up on them and I love them so much. They are just as good now as they were when I was young. The one I read, that spooky castle kind of thing, is the first book that was ever published, ever written. So of course I had to start with that one. It's basically this series of 3 young boys who just are investigators, who solve these mysteries. And it is so entertaining. And in this book, Albert Hitfield, who is basically Alfred Hitchcock, but the copyrighted version of him, he's on the lookout for a new set for a film he wants to shoot. The 3 investigators decide they're gonna put themselves on the case and look at this one specific haunted castle that is near where they live that no one ever wants to stay at because it is reportedly haunted. They want their first case to be finding out if the castle is haunted and if it can be the set for this movie that this movie director is planning on shooting. It is so entertaining. It is so funny. It made me so happy. So yeah, that was that one. Afterwards, I read It by Stephen King. We're set in a small American town called Derry, and the book starts out in 1957, where one night a young boy called George Denborough is mysteriously murdered. And it is not going to be the last murder that takes place over the course of the next few months. It is set in 2 timelines. The first timeline is the year after that, as George's older brother and his friends basically try to find out what is going on with that string of murders, because they believe there's something more sinister, maybe something supernatural or haunted going on there. And the second timeline is roughly 3 decades later, in the 1980s, as all of our main characters are adults. One of them, the only one who stayed in Derry, starts calling them all up, reminding them of a promise they made that if these strings of murders were ever going to be continued, that they would have to return to Derry and try to stop it for real that time. And we are switching between the past and the present timeline, and slowly unraveling what went on back then and what is going on right now. And it's really spooky, but also incredibly slow moving. You get to see all of these inhabitants of the town. You meet so many people. The town starts to kind of feel alive. You almost feel like you are living in that town yourself. Especially, I really loved the first timeline in the 1950s. It creates this feeling almost of nostalgia for this place you have never been in, that doesn't even really exist, for these people you've never met, but that you feel like were your friends almost. It's a really special kind of feeling. Of course, however, it is not a perfect story. There are quite a few elements to it that can be criticized. There is a lot of things like, for example, just the casual racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, prejudice in general. There is so much of that here. But in my opinion, if you are going to write a book about a small town in the 1960s or 1950s turning to the 1960s in America, if there is not casual racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, then you're not writing a realistic story. What I really didn't like, though, is the way Bev, in that group of friends, she's the only girl. They are 11 years old, mind you, the way she was sexualized. Because that did not have anything to do with the time this was written in. It's just the author being kind of gross at that point. I really tried to look past that, and I could almost look past it until one specific choice that Stephen King made in the resolution of the past timeline. If you have read the book, you will know what I mean, because there is one narrative choice he made for how that conflict was going to be resolved, and I hated it. I was so mad at that, because it would have been one of my new favorite Stephen King books. Nothing will ever top Insomnia, but it would have been so close to how much I loved Insomnia if that had not happened, because now I don't like the book as much anymore. I have very complicated feelings towards it by Stephen King. Then I listened to Salem's Lot, also by Stephen King. This is a reread for me because I read Salem's Lot already, but it's been quite a while. And I wanted to revisit it because I read it right after Dracula, the first time I read it. And I went into it expecting basically what I got from Dracula. And I think it is just unfair to compare anything to that book. And so I did not like Salem's Lot the first time around. Having read so many other books by Stephen King now, I knew what to expect, and so I wanted to give it another shot. I did enjoy it much more the second time around. Listening to it was maybe also why, because it's just a very entertaining audiobook. It is the story of Ben Mears, who is an author and who has recently lost his wife and is still very much dealing with the aftermath of that and the grief of that. He has also just recently decided he wants to write this book about this town called Salem's Lot, where he spent some of his childhood years. He left that town after a really traumatic thing that happened to him there. Something really spooky went on, and it's just never left his head properly. And he would now really like to write a book about that town, specifically that house where that weird thing happened to him, because there is this house that is very much the core of all of the spookiness that goes on there. He goes to the town, he starts living in the town, writing his book. Suddenly a lot of people start dying. And are there vampires or are there not vampires? Who would know? The people who read the story, that is who would know. It is Stephen King's take on Dracula. Basically a Dracula retelling, but with a lot of creative freedom. If you view it as a separate entity, I think it was really entertaining. It's not a favorite Stephen King of mine, but I liked my time in it. I found it entertaining. It was spooky, it was creepy, it was a perfect atmosphere for this time of the year, and it was exactly what I was looking for. It's a good story. It's a really good story. After Salem's Lot, I decided to pick up Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is the story of a very young woman who meets this recently widowed man who everyone says has not gotten over the death of his wife, but she falls in love with him and they decide to get married and move into his house in England, which is called Manderley. And it has this reputation for being this beautiful, stunning home, and they had all of these great lavish parties going on there back when his late wife was still alive. As she moves into this house, our main character basically becomes haunted by the idea of the ex-wife of this man, who is called Rebecca. Our main character feels so inferior to her, and it is just in her head, this picture that is created of Rebecca is one that she keeps comparing herself to, and it kind of just consumes her entire being. This is such a well-executed book, because the way it was written, the way Rebecca was depicted, I felt so bad for the main character, because I felt like if I were in our main character's situation, I would never want to marry a man who had been married to someone like Rebecca, because I kind of fell in love with Rebecca. It made me feel so sad for her, because honestly, I don't think the love interest treated her very well. Max, the man she marries, I don't think he's a very good husband. And their dynamic kind of reminded me of the dynamic of Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre. And I don't like that love story either. I don't think they are very successful love stories. But in both cases, I think the book is still a very good book without that. And in Rebecca, I think that was kind of mended. Most of my issues with that relationship were mended. But still, overall, I don't think it's my favorite kind of relationships, but I am very picky when it comes to that. I fell in love with that book. First of all, the writing, it is beautifully written. The descriptions of Manderley, that house, of the atmosphere itself, of the nature surrounding it. It is so beautiful. Also, just the way specifically our main character's psychology is explored is so vividly done. I found her so relatable. I saw so much of myself in her, and it made the story so much easier to read and so much more relatable to read. One of the main things, I haven't even mentioned this yet, which I think is so highly symbolic in and of itself, is we know barely anything about our main character. We don't know her name, we don't know her age, and we know only very basic informations about her life, the actual facts. Of course, we're in her head and we know everything she's feeling, but we really don't know very much about her, which is such an interesting take on a story like this. And it's so unique because of it. And I really respect Daphne du Maurier for that, because I think that is so well done. Honestly, probably my favorite part of this story was how the inevitability of time's passing was explored. And our main character is so obsessed with that idea that once time has passed, it will never be able to be rewound again. You will never relive the moment you're living currently in the exact vivid way you are experiencing it right now. That is written so beautifully. It's a really good book. I really loved Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Then I read The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which is the first ever Gothic classic. Or actually, I didn't read it. I listened to it on audio because, again, I wasn't sure if I was going to like it. So I listened to it rather. I'm trying to be more intentional about my book buying. It is basically about a man who is obsessed with the idea of a male heir because of this one mysterious prophecy. So to ensure that his lineage was going to be upheld, he really wants to marry off his son because his son is really sickly. And so the book basically starts out with that marriage being about to happen. Then there's this huge helmet that falls and kills someone, I won't say who. From there on, just absolute chaos starts to ensue. It is even more over the top than The Monk, probably. More ridiculous, less subtle, even less subtle, if you can even say that. They feel very similar in a lot of ways, The Monk and The Castle of Otranto. It was so ridiculous that it was really funny, and I think that was really intentional because I know a bit about the author now. And he was a character. I don't know much about Lord Byron, but from what I know, he kind of gave me the same vibes Horace Walpole did. It is a very preachy story about faith and how to properly conduct yourself as a human being. And it's also so dark. It's funny, yes, but it's also really, really dark. I felt so bad for every single female character in this book because, well, I think you could say there's some underlying criticism going on there, and there probably is, but it felt so hard to read about or listen to. There's so much mistreatment, abuse, and just so many people being so cruel for absolutely no reason. It was more entertaining because I listened to it, but I think it's also one of those books like The Monk. If I had read it, I would not have enjoyed it at all. So I think maybe pick it up as an audiobook. It's for free on Spotify, so why not? So that was The Castle of Otranto. Now I have read the very first Gothic classic that was ever written. Yay me! And with that, we are at the end of the video. Those were all of the books I read in the month of September. I loved most of these, and I found some really, really memorable ones here. I hope you enjoyed. I am very grateful you were here. I hope you're having a nice day. If you are not having a nice day, that is fine too. I'm thinking about you either way. And I am so, so grateful you were here listening to me talk about books. If you have anything to say, maybe tell me, what kind of books did you read this month? Did you find any new favorites? What were your thoughts? Have you read any of the books I've talked about? I would be curious to know. What did you think of them? Thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna love you and leave you now. And I will see you again very soon. So until then, bye-bye.